So the last time we were together, we were talking about Hollywood, and we were talking about movies, actors who were being questioned about being communists, and their content were very pro-communistic in their movie content, and very anti-American, very anti-capitalistic. And when those type of movies were coming out and actors were coming out, some of these individuals were being put in jail. And Ronald Reagan, again, here's the actor, spoke out, and here's him in Congress speaking, and eventually he does become president, and ironically enough, he is the president that kind of ends the Cold War itself. Anyway, let's go to letter C, some trials. Some trials in the government, one by a government official named Alger Hiss, another great name in American history. He was an official accused of being a communist. Again, he's not the first one, but he becomes the first major news story because he does get convicted, but not for what you think. This is a picture of Alger Hiss on trial. You can see how many people are actually in this meeting here. This meeting here in Congress itself, an actual Congress hearing. He was never convicted of being a communist, which is, I guess, good, but he was convicted of perjury. Now, the word perjury means lying under oath, and that is a punishable crime. You are not allowed to lie under oath when you are on a court case or a court hearing case, but he was never convicted of being a communist. Now, you might be like, well, how did they catch him in the middle of a lie? Basically, what it was is there was this guy who worked for a news magazine who said that he knew Alger Hiss and that Alger Hiss and him were acquaintances and they were friends. And this guy was an open communist. And they accused Alger Hiss of having a relationship with this guy. And Alger Hiss said, I'm not a communist. I've never been a communist. I don't plan on being a communist. And so they kind of were going back and forth. But the big thing that they caught him on was lying that he actually knew this guy. And that's what they caught him with, this lie. Richard Nixon, he was a California congressman who headed the investigation against Alger Hiss, and he gained a ton of popularity here. This is a picture of Richard Nixon. And yes, again, this is the other future president that runs as president in the 1960s, and eventually becomes president in 1969. But this is a young Richard Nixon looking at what is some film there. I'm sure you guys don't even know what that is. We used to put those in actual cameras themselves. And so anyway, but this is Richard Nixon. So we talked about two future presidents that were against the communists being in our country. McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy is a senator from this great cheese state, Wisconsin. And he's a senator. He's a younger senator, kind of an up-and-coming, trying to make a name for himself. And he started accusing people of communism, especially government officials. And what he's realizing is that he was gaining a lot of popularity for accusing people. Because the more people he accused, the more people felt like he was doing a really good job of coming up with good information and accusing people of actually being communists. And it created a lot of sense of fear, but he was gaining popularity because everybody was just so pumped that he was, quote unquote, finding all of these bad guys in our government. And this is a picture of him. He's the guy on the left covering the microphones up. So that they're kind of talking secrets here. This is in a congressional meeting. And McCarthyism is a term that they created, and it's called McCarthyism, and it's advancing a political career by accusing others of disloyalty in being a communist. Now, how would this advance your political career? Well, one of the things that you would do is you would accuse people that were not from your particular party. You would accuse them of being communists. One of the other things that you could do is you could just target people that you didn't like in the government for being a communist. And again, if they denied it, then you would say, well, of course, that's what a communist would say. And then if they were actually a communist, then they would get kicked out of office. And the thing is that if you really fought back hard, then he would say, well, only a real communist would be worried that we can investigate their life. And people were saying, well, I'm not afraid of you investigating our life, but you don't have a right or a constitutional right to do so. And he said, well, if you're afraid of it, if you're afraid of me investigating you, it's because you are a communist yourself. So it was kind of a lose-lose situation for practically everybody when it came down to that. So anyway, that's advancing a political career by accusing others of disloyalty and being a communist. This is a quote from him. The State Department is infested with communists. I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department government. 205 people is a lot of people in the State Department working for our government that are communists. That's a lot of people. And again, he's saying that he has a lot of people, but it was just such very circumstantial evidence. It wasn't super clear. It wasn't guaranteed evidence. It was usually little things. Maybe they attended like a meeting where another communist person was. That's all it could have been. But he's accusing all these people, and he's actually goes on to eventually blame the army for losing to the communists because there were army people who were communists. So he goes well over the top. But McCarthyism becomes very identifiable in the 1950s for advancing your political career by tearing others down and falsely accusing them of being communistic. Again, very similar to the Palmer raids, not too much different. His is actually probably more over the top. All right, let's quickly talk about the Korean War. Next to the Korean War, if you want to write 1950 to 1953, that's how long the Korean War is going to last, about 3 years. A lot of times it's considered the forgotten war because it's kind of tucked in between Vietnam and World War II, but there's a good chance that you guys might have a grandparent that is still alive today that might have fought in, or a great-grandparent that fought in the Korean War, as it was a little bit later than World War II. Let's talk about rebuilding Asia. First of all, Japan has to rebuild itself, much like Europe is going to have to rebuild itself. And what's interesting is the guy that went into Japan to actually destroy them, Douglas MacArthur, is actually put in charge. He becomes like the governor of Japan. You might be like, we sent him over there to like be in charge of like rebuilding everything. Yep, we did. We sent him over there as like a diplomatic relations, but also as a military leader, and just to try to get him to help rebuild as much of Japan as he possibly could. And the U.S. and Japan actually become pretty good allies moving forward post-World War II. This is a picture of General MacArthur and Emperor Hirohito. This is obviously post-World War II. They seem, fairly cordial. Again, I'm not really sure why MacArthur's pants are always so high. Just doesn't make any sense, but hey, to each their own. Hopefully you got all those notes on that one. Next, number 2, Korea. Korea is actually going to be divided at the 38th parallel. Now, when we've talked about those lines and you talked about like parallels, I guess, almost think of it like this. What we're saying is that it's divided between the north and the south. I'm having you guys, if you guys can, if you have your books, I'll have the map up in just a second. But you have a communist Kim Il-sung, and if that name kind of sounds a little bit familiar, sorry to interrupt again, but go to page 462 if you have your book near. But anyway, the communist leader of communist North Korea is Kim Il-sung. This is from the Kim family, which is still in charge today, and the non-communist leader of South Korea, Syngman Rhee. He is the leader of non-communist South Korea. And he kind of worked more with us. We pretty much stayed away from North Korea as they were very communistic. And so we tried to stay away from them as much as we could. But again, we did try to work with the South Koreans. Now this is the Korean War seen in 4 different maps. when you think about this 4 different maps, there's first going to be an invasion here. North Korea actually invades South Korea. Now, a lot of people believe that China was really the one that was pushing for this, and mainly to have more countries become communistic. Truman actually puts Douglas MacArthur, because he's over there in charge of the United Nations U.S. troops, because we have the United Nations out today. And he calls it a police action to stay away from the fear of actually calling it a war. Understand that if you call it a war, now you've got to have like congressional approval and all sorts of things. So he just kind of calls it a police action in order to stay away from the fear of war. And if you notice in this map, you have this divided here, and North Korea invades here. Here's the capital of Seoul, South Korea. And then eventually they're going to push all the way down here to what we would call the Pusan perimeter, and this area here, and they're going to push all the way down there. And so then at this point in time, MacArthur's put in charge, and MacArthur's actually going to make a daring move, and he's going to, instead of just working his way back north, he's actually going to take his troops down this way and bring them all the way in here towards the Incheon Peninsula, and then work his way north to try to split that group up. And so at the beginning stages of war, North was conquering the South pretty easily, and the North wasn't doing very, very well. The South wasn't doing very well at all. The North was dominating this. And the U.S. sought reinforcements and retaliation. They're needing a way by which they go after the North Koreans. And General MacArthur actually wants to make bombing runs in North Korea. And he wants to actually, when they start fighting, he actually wants to go into China and start going after them. Why? Well, because they're communistic, and he feels like they're assisting the North Koreans. And he was technically right. So then we have a counterattack, which the move works. Again, as we said, here's what the counterattack is. This is where the South Koreans and the U.S. UN troops come in here and then fight this way down, fight this way north. And they push the North Koreans back all the way towards this border, getting close to the Yalu River. Now, they do not destroy all this land and just devastate it like the Civil War type stuff. But what they did do was push them back. However, China got involved and started to help North Korea by sending bombs and troops to fight against the South Koreans. Well, this just makes MacArthur absolutely furious that this takes place. And MacArthur is going to ask Truman for more money, more bombs, and more people to go after the North Koreans and eventually the Chinese. And that creates a conflict between MacArthur and Truman, which we're going to stop here because I don't think I'm going to have enough time to thoroughly explain the conflict between MacArthur and Truman.